catalyst or catalysis and mechanism. There's not a whole lot left here, maybe 5 or 6 slides, and we're done with chapter 14. Woohoo! We already looked at energy diagrams, and turns out it's not all that simple, although from our perspective or from the scope that really is important, that's all that you need to know. You have some sort of energy of reactance. You stick energy in to overcome this energy of activation, right? That's what I've drawn in here, the difference between the maximum, or so labeled transition state. This is when there's enough sufficient kinetic energy for the reaction to proceed. And then whether the reaction is exothermic or endothermic, it's going to go to its product. By the way, haven't said this yet, if this reaction is endothermic, then the energy of your product is going to be higher than that before, so it would look I'll draw it over here. You go through an energy of activation, and so the difference here would be positive. Delta H would be positive, and if it's exothermic, delta H, as shown here, the reaction between O3 and O is exothermic. You have a loss of energy. But it's sometimes not as simple as raising the energy. There are other factors. Sometimes there's a mechanism. You have to go through several steps. A molecule has to orient with another molecule in a perfect orientation before it can proceed, or other factors. Now this here shown, there are actually 2 transition states when you use a catalyst. And a catalyst can be something like an enzyme, which will orient which will lock these in. You've all heard of the key and lock type mechanism, where this shape is locked in and then forces to be faced with the other oxygen here, and so they're forced, or they're enabled to react with each other, and so that lowers the energy of activation. In this particular case, you have 2 different transition states. There's no need to, sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 3, and the reaction path can have several different transition states or intermediates. But regardless, so there are 2 different things that we can look at. Orientation factor, already mentioned that briefly, that 2 molecules must be not just collide into each other, they also have to have the right orientation. So if the right orientation is as shown here, if you have to have the chlorines facing each other for this reaction to proceed, then only when those 2 collide with each other, with the 2 chlorines, will the reaction proceed. That's called effective collision. Any other collision does not result in a reaction. And so there's the collision factor, and then there's the orientation factor. So this probably shows it a little better, right? So you can have 2 particles collide with sufficient energy, but if they don't orient, if they don't have the same orientation or the correct orientation, there is no reaction here. So and so that's, here we have the collision factor as well as the orientation factor. Those are all little pieces that are needed for the overall picture of kinetics and reaction rates. We don't need to go into any really great detail. Just be aware that there can be multi-steps that are not shown in an overall reaction, and they're not shown in the kinetic or the rate law sometimes either. Only substances where the concentration actually affects the rate show up, right? Zero order doesn't show up, so they're not part of the mechanism then probably. So you've all probably seen this. This shows you how a catalyst works. An enzyme is a catalyst, and so if this purple compound here called the substrate is what needs to react or decompose in this case, this breaks apart into, purple goes into red and blue. How much easier than that does it get? But so if this was outside of the human body, or an animal or a plant, then we could make this happen by sticking, maybe heating it up to 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and so then you can break that. But in the human body, you can't accomplish these temperatures. We have to do everything at body temperature, and so that's why we have these enzymes. And so here this enzyme perfectly locks this particular substrate, and then once it's locked in, it's a lot easier. They have the orientation factor diminished or maximized, not diminished, and then the collision factor is no longer as important, and we can just split this molecule. So this is how it works. It's just a little cartoon. Catalysis usually works with lock and key mechanism. Now here we're looking at in bold down here is a reaction between hydrogen and nitrogen monoxide, and it proceeds to form water and nitrogen gas. And so what actually happens, and so the observed rate actually depends on the concentration of hydrogen, and so it's first order with the concentration with respect to hydrogen, and second order with respect to NO. But what actually happens is we have 3 different steps, and I don't want to look at them in any great detail, just highlight that there's a fast step, and then there's a slow step, and then another fast step. And so if you have a slow step, that's usually the rate determining step, because it controls everything else. First of all, this is fast, but it can't proceed to go on to the third until the second step is done. So that really controls the rate or the traffic or the entire set of reactions. And then once that occurs, the third reaction is fast, so that basically happens instantaneously. So the actual rate depends on this step here, and it's as expected then H2 and N2O2, which are our reactants here. The NO2 doesn't show up, but what's also shown here is this double arrow, and we're going to be seeing that a lot in the next chapter. This is an equilibrium arrow. That means that we don't just have a forward reaction. If you take a piece of iron and you rust it, once it's rusted, it's over. There's no going back. There's no equilibrium. But that's not true for many other reactions, especially aqueous ones. Now this is in the gas phase, and so we have a forward reaction. It would have a rate here, that's K1, the one NO going to N2O, and so we would have a rate that's equal to K1 times the concentration of NO, that's NO, to the second power. I'm just using the coefficient here. And then you have a reverse reaction, which has a rate equal to K minus 1, that's shown here, times the concentration of N2O2. So those are 2 independent rates. Now initially, this could be a microsecond because it's fast, but nevertheless, initially you have a concentration of 0, of N2O, of the product, and so you have a faster rate. The K1 here it occurs faster, but then the minute that you form this product, it reacts to form reactants back, so you have a reverse rate. And so very quickly this gets to an equilibrium where the forward reaction is equal to the back reaction, or the rate of them are equal. That's called a steady state equilibrium, and that's represented here. Right? So the 2 rates are equal. One is forward and one is backwards. And so once that's established, we can proceed with the second reaction, which is the rate determining step. And then the third reaction is also fast. You can establish rates here or rate expressions here based on the reactants and then some sort of K. But one last thing that I want to mention and show you is that in order to derive at the overall reaction, you can add, kind of like we did for the thermochemistry. We had Hess's law, where you added out the products and the reactants, and you canceled out redundant species. Like here you can see that NO2 is a product, but N2O is a product, but N2O is also a reactant, and so that drops out, and so you only have hydrogen and 2 hydrogens. And so there's a second hydrogen that comes in here, so that's where this 2 comes from. And then we have the NO, and then the other thing that drops out is the N2O here. Okay, those are just intermediates, and so those are found at the transition states of that mechanism I showed you earlier. And then the products are here 2 waters and 1 N2. That's really all I have to say. Do some active homework, and I'll see you in chapter 15.